All right, Genesis chapter 39, of course, is a resumption of details about Joseph's life. If you go back to 37, of course, it was there that we learned about in our last study, him being sold into slavery by his brothers. But that account, remember, began with the history of Joseph, or rather Jacob, and the generations of Jacob. So this is really talking about Jacob and his legacy and what's happening with his descendants. We just briefly noted last week Genesis 38 with Judah and pointed out that really Joseph and Judah are the two that are focused on more than anything through this section of Genesis to the very end of Genesis, when Judah receives the blessing and Shiloh would come through him, the Christ, the Savior, would come through him. And here in chapter 39, we're going to see a great contrast to Judah's character and behavior in Joseph and the way that he was and his uprightness. So let's look at Genesis 39, verses 1 through 6. Who will read that? Ron.
Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes. Did I go too far?
Just slightly. Totally good. Right. In verse 1 there introduces us to this Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. So when it says he's an officer of Pharaoh, what is that telling us? What does that mean?
Over the house.
He's not over the house of Pharaoh, but
He's personally connected to Pharaoh. So like over his personal.
well, he does have that in the captain of the guard, but being an officer of Pharaoh, he was one of his high government officials that served in a governmental role. Today, in our country, you might think of Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, those cabinet officials that are in those high positions, great responsibility, great authority. There's a certain amount of power. There would be a certain amount of wealth involved with him, as we see later about Potiphar and things that he has. But he's a very high government official, is the one who has bought him. And as Mike said he's a captain of the guard. Anybody have anything to add about that? Because there's some things that are mentioned here, various places that you read about what that role actually was. Any thoughts? He was in charge of, in part, Pharaoh's personal bodyguard, the troops that would protect him. It may be that he's not the military commander if they go out to war, but sort of the one who would oversee the security forces internally for Egypt. But then also with what is written about this, it's related to being an executioner. So if somebody was going to face the death penalty, that would be under his purview. He would see that was done. But high, very powerful official is the one who bought Joseph and put him to work in his household. But verse 2 tells us what? Yeah, the Lord was with him. What's it explaining to us here?
I mean, it's explaining even if we're taken in captivity and you obey the Lord is going to be with you throughout it all.
Yeah, what's Joseph's, this may be redundant, but what's Joseph's condition here? He's a slave. Where? Yes, in Egypt, which means he's not where? He's not home. He's in a foreign land as a slave in this man's house. And what it's helping us to see is that no matter where we are in this world, as a servant of God, we're truly not alone. The Lord is with Joseph here. He's watching over him. He's caring for him. He's looking out for his best interest. And so the Lord is with him. Now, later in life, of course, hopefully we'll get to the point in the study where Joseph recognizes that. He's very, very clear about, the reason I'm here, because the Lord is the one who brought me here. And the reason all of this has happened. At this point, whether or not he could see that, I seriously doubt it. How old is he here? 17 years old. Sold into slavery, now down in Potiphar's house. But it says that the Lord is with him. There's providence in Joseph's life. And the one who bought him, it says, he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. This is no ordinary master. This just isn't somebody who maybe lived in one of the major cities who needed a household servant to take care of things around, an urban setting. This is a man who, not only in that governmental position, but as we see later, he has an estate that Joseph is going to end up running. But we'll get to that in a little bit. It says he's successful. Verse 2, a very successful man. So question number 1, describe Joseph's character and the results, and why is this surprising given the circumstances, as we read there in 1 through 6. What about his character, and then the results of that character?
His character was good, and he obeyed the Lord. The result was everybody around him received rewards from him, from God through him.
Okay, they did do that. Remember, the Lord originally promised that people would be blessed. Those who blessed him, blessed Abraham, would be blessed. Those who blessed his descendants would be blessed. Those who cursed his descendants would be cursed. And here's a case where Joseph is doing well and he is serving as a blessing to Potiphar's house. Any other thoughts there?
Well, we see the stewardship of Joseph and the things that are entrusted to him as a result of his behavior. There are things we don't see, and that's resentment, depression. He puts his eyes on the things that are forward, and we see that forward thinking manifested in Joseph.
Okay, so one of the things we need to understand is there's a passing of time in this. It wasn't Joseph showed up as a 17-year-old kid, and a week later, 2 weeks, 2 months, probably not even 6 months later, Potiphar's like, you got everything. It's over a process of time, or one of Ron's favorite things is everything's a process. Well, this was a process over time. Mike?
Yeah, and I think if you go where Joseph was, he was the favorite in his household with this great coat, and all that kind of stuff, where he is now. A lot has changed.
Okay.
Adaptable to the change.
So when he shows up here, 6 months before, what were the relative positions? 6 months before, he sold to Potiphar's house and begins working. Where, might just said it, but draw it out a little bit. He's back in his home.
6 months before, he was the favorite of his father, and he's going to check on his brothers. He's not doing the work. He's just going to check on them.
Right. He had been with his father. His brothers were out in the field. He was the privileged son. He was in the position of honor among that household. Life was very good. And now he's a slave in a foreign land to someone else. But he is not letting that get to him, as Ron said. It says here, as you look at this, let's see, verse 4. Joseph did what right at the beginning?
He found favor in his servant.
Found favor in Potiphar's eyes. I find that interesting when he was the favored son and now he's the favored servant, but he wasn't the favored servant because of any family relationship, because he was the firstborn son of the favorite wife. That's not how he has favor here. But he has favor how, Ron? What's the very next thing?
In serving, he was a steward. The things that were entrusted to him, he looked to those things as being responsible. And as you're mentioning, Stephen, we think about other people who are taken out of, if we say, luxury or privilege, and these privileged people are put into a situation of adversity. They usually don't excel. You see the contrast here.
Right, they've been pampered. I mean, personally, sorry if it offends anyone, but this is the truth. We have a generation of people who've been pampered, and then they get out in the real world, and all of a sudden they're not pampered anymore, or and companies have tried to cater to that, and I think they've recently seen, this really isn't working all that great, and you don't get your all these little luxuries and things, and they're all of a sudden realizing, this is reality. This is what it is to work. Joseph doesn't have that. He gets in there, he serves Pharaoh, he's doing a good job, and he finds favor in the sight of Pharaoh, because what he's doing is yielding results, not Pharaoh, Potiphar. He's yielding results for Potiphar here. Nancy.
Well, to me, it shows that character is not circumstantial.
Okay.
His character is his character. He has that no matter what circumstances.
Exactly. That screams through this. But that also, what we're reading here, informs us that when he was back home with his father, with his brothers, he wasn't a snotty brat that provoked his brothers. When it says he brought a bad report to his father, it's because he has this character that says this is right, this is wrong, and this shouldn't be happening. So you look at that, you realize he gets down here, let me ask you this, is Joseph sleeping in? No, he's not. You know he's getting up early. He's getting after it. He's doing the work that needs to be done. And it's showing. And Potiphar recognizes that. He has the proper behavior there in Potiphar's house. And when he does that, he gains his trust over time. And there's obviously more and more that's being given to him over time under his responsibility, his care, his oversight, and things like that, to the point that Potiphar says, I'm putting everything under you. Now, how many years that took, I don't know, but I think it's safe to say it took years to get to that point, because you just don't have a 17-year-old come in there and then all of a sudden, hey, this is all yours. Because Potiphar has a big estate, evidently. This is essentially his business, and he's turning it over to Joseph to run while he focuses on his work for the Pharaoh. Paul.
In verse 5 there, it says inside and out, even over the field.
Exactly. He's got charge of the household and of the field, the estate, the whatever it is that they're raising in crops or animals or anything like that. He has charge of both of those, both the house and the field. Any other thoughts there? Ron?
Stephen, as you were mentioning previously, the nature of Potiphar himself, position of authority, the position of leadership, he is a man who can make an assessment of individuals who can perform and those who won't.
Right. This is no fool in Potiphar. He's made the right assessment here, and he's seeing. It's interesting how it says he sees how the Lord is blessing his estate in his sphere through Joseph. Now, whether Potiphar was a believer in Jehovah or whether he knew Joseph is a worshiper of Jehovah, and I see that his God is blessing me through him, however that is, and I suspect that was the case. But however it is, he sees the Lord is blessing Potiphar through Joseph's efforts. Joseph is working, he's diligent, and so I'm going to turn everything over to him. Very smart decision on Potiphar's part. The last part of verse 6, what does it tell us about Joseph? Okay, form and appearance. He was well built. He was physically a strapping young lad, we might say. Good looking. Where did he get all that from? His mother. His mother, it says the exact same thing. She's beautiful in form and appearance. And he's got the genetics of his mother. He's a good-looking young man. And so that sets us up for what, of course, unfolds next in the account. Anything before we press further? All right, let's read verses 7 through 13, please. Who will grab that? Go ahead, Philip.
It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was as he spoke to me. Pardon me. So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her and lie with her or be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside.
Okay. I gave you one too many verses here, I believe. But Potiphar's wife here, of course, is pursuing Joseph. In question number 2, I had asked, what is the pressure Joseph faced, and how is his response to Potiphar's wife an example to young and old men and women? So, just breaking it down, what's happening here?
Yes,
Clint?
somebody who's higher than he is, wanting him to do something. And he's a foreigner in a foreign land, a young man with a whole household, a whole basically corporation under his purview. He's just got a lot. He's got a lot of stresses in his life. So his boss's wife is after him in a bad way. He's over all this stuff, and he's a foreigner in a foreign land. So there's eyes that are on him.
Yes, exactly. Clint, do you have something?
Yeah, he's consistently persevering through temptation.
Right.
And then he even explains to the cause of this temptation, Potiphar's wife, "I'm not going to do this with you because," and he gives a real good answer.
Yes. Yes.
He's very direct with her. He's upfront. "I'm not going to do this," and that's beneficial for us today. Why don't you drink? "I don't like the taste." No, gives the right answer, right? Because the Bible running to avoid sin. He's fleeing from the danger once it's just right there and immediate. He has the appropriate response every time. And for us to say that, how did we get that way? We had to have practiced that. And so he's practicing. He's thought ahead of time. If she does this, I'm going to have to bolt. And he doesn't. So he's, in my mind, he's already prepared for what she's trying to get him to do.
Right. Was there something else over here? All right, Paul?
Yeah, this sets an example for us. No matter whether it's your supervisor or whatever, if it's wrong, you need to get out.
Right, exactly right. So it says that she cast longing eyes after him. So what is that telling us? Longing eyes. Okay, she's filled with lust. All right, so it's not just men that can have lust, but women can have lust too. And here's an example of that. And she desires him. It would not be uncommon for Potiphar to have a wife that was much younger than him. She may be closer to Joseph's age, but she may still be older, but she has this desire for him and she begins to pursue him. And let's break down the answer that Joseph gives to her, because there's a threefold thing that he gives in responding to her. First of all, in verse 8, says, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed everything to my hand, no one greater than me. And part of what he's saying there is, I have a very important, responsible position. I do not want to jeopardize that. The second thing that he says is when he's talking about there's no one greater than me, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you're his wife. He's saying, I'm not going to do this to him. It would be wrong against him. I don't have a right to you. Everything else is under my charge, and I have authority over it, but I do not have a right to you because you belong to my master. So he has a position that's important and comes with responsibility, but he also has a responsibility and obligations to Potiphar himself in that. So he would destroy his position, he would destroy that relationship with Potiphar, and then really what he's doing is he's building this argument up to the climax of it, and the last reason is what? I can't sin against God. I'm not going to do it. And it's very interesting how he describes it. How does he describe what she's asking to be done, what she's pressuring him to do there in verse 9? It's great wickedness. It's not a fling. It's not an affair. It's not a dalliance. If I said that right, I think that's what people call it sometimes. It's not an indiscretion. Politicians today want to say, well, there was an indiscretion. No, it was great wickedness is what it was. It was sin. Right. Oh, it was a mistake. I made a mistake. No, you committed great wickedness. He frames it out very clearly, as Clint was saying. He puts it right to her up front, no. And here's why. So anybody that finds himself in that situation, what should they do? Somebody's pursuing them. No. I'm going to tell you why. There's no messing around here. He's not entertaining it. He's not flattered by it. I've got an important position. I've worked too hard. I've got too much responsibility here. I've got a relationship with Potiphar. You're his wife. You don't belong to me. You belong to him. And God, I have a relationship to him. I need to honor him. I can't do this wickedness. It's wrong. And he's conveying to her, what you're asking is wrong. It shouldn't be. So he's very blunt, as Clint said. Any other thoughts? Okay, Ron, then John.
Stephen, as we this, covenant breakers will not inherit the kingdom of God. And
Mhm.
that is a bond, as he recognizes her. He basically states that because Potiphar has kept nothing from him except his wife. As you said, that is a unique relationship. It's a sacred relationship, and it's a covenant.
Exactly. And he recognizes that even among these pagan Egyptians,
Yes.
that's a God-ordained relationship.
Yes, and as we know with Abraham and Sarah, it was recognized then too.
Right.
So what are you trying to do to us, Abraham?
Exactly. With the Egyptians.
Yes.
Exactly. John.
I was going to make that exact point. If you go back to Abraham, whether it was the Philistines or the Egyptians, back with Abraham and Sarah, marriage was instituted by God from the very beginning, and all the heathen nations around the world knew that marriage was sacred, as these heathen Egyptians did. And people nowadays want to say, well, marriage is a Judeo-Christian idea that is maybe even modern Western European in nature. Well, no, this goes back to the very beginning, and all the heathen nations around the world, because of what God ordained with Adam and Eve, knew that marriage was something that was sacred, and it follows all the way through to today. And it's not something that can be explained away by the modern historians and scientists as something that's unnatural. It's what God intended from the very beginning.
Exactly. That's the way he designed humanity for this relationship.
The marriage and family.
Exactly right. Mike.
I was going to say also, he knows where these blessings are coming from. Potiphar recognized it. His wife obviously recognized it. If he severs that relationship with God, what happens to those blessings? So there's a lot of responsibility in his relationship with God that he has, so they can continue to have the blessings as well.
Exactly. Clint and then Nancy.
The last part, the last half of Proverbs 6 and Proverbs 7, talks about warning against adultery and the adulteress. So, Solomon knew this too, right? And one of the verses that I think is pretty fitting here, that I think Joseph knew, was in verse 29 of chapter 6. So is he who goes into his neighbor's wife; none who touches her will go unpunished. It's destruction. Joseph knew that.
Mm-hmm.
He explained it to her.
Mm-hmm.
I have everything. If I do this, I will have nothing.
Right. Nancy.
Well, sin, though we often do not think of it in these terms, is rarely ever a single element. In this case, it's clearly defined. It affects your situation. It affects others. And first and foremost, it is a sin against God. It's offensive to God. But it's rarely ever one single element.
Okay. She's taken us right exactly where I want to go. Put a fine point on this. We see this laid out in here. Lessons regarding adultery. It will jeopardize your work, your business, or your employment. It very often affects people in those things. People who have affairs at work, it destroys that work environment. It can destroy a business. It can bring it down. We know in times past at least, it has brought powerful people in government down when it's come out that they've had an affair, and it destroys their personal life, of course, and it jeopardizes relationships with people you respect. Joseph respected Potiphar, and he recognized that's going to completely destroy that relationship. And so can't focus on, oh, this is going to be pleasurable, this is going to be fun, this is going to be exciting. Well, what's the other consequence out here? The long-term consequence, not the moment. What else is there? Well, I'm going to destroy my relationships with people around me that I respect. They're going to look at me and realize I'm dishonorable. And then, of course, it is that sin against God. So it tells us here that he gives this answer. He tells her no, but verse 10. What's her response? Pestering him day after day after day. What's going on here? trying to wear him down. Anything else? Clint?
To me, the way the ESV lays it out, it says, would not listen to her, lie beside her, or be with her. It's almost like she's deceptively talking to him and saying, hey, come on in my room real quick. I need you to do something for me. You know, so that type of situation is, I'm not doing nothing for you. I'm not even listening to you anymore. That's how bad it got.
Right. Right. So understand the reason she's coming back after him day by day is because Satan knew there was a chance. He's being tempted. Okay? He's being tempted. How are we tempted? What does James tell us? Through our own desires, we're lured away. If this was not a temptation, Satan would have left him alone. He would have found another way to come after him. He's a young man. He has certain desires, passions within him, and she's coming back after him day after day after day to try to break that down, to break down his self-control, his self-discipline, and to get him to cross that line into sin. But he maintains his character and refuses day after day after day. It wasn't as though faced one temptation, verses 7, 8, and 9, and he gave the answer, and then from then on it was never a temptation. He refused it day after day after day. He absolutely had a lot of faith in the Lord. That's where he's looking. That's where he's depending. That's where he's getting his strength. Because if he doesn't have the Lord, he's not going to have that strength. Right. Exactly right. So she's pestering him day after day. Then lo and behold, one day, he happens to be in the house alone. None of the other servants are there. She's there. And she tries to take advantage of that situation. And as Clint said, when she goes to try to get him to do that, he flees and he runs outside, and his garment is left with her there. And we'll talk about her using that in just a little bit. But it's likely that Joseph is around 25 to 27 years old at this time. As you unfold, we read the next chapter about him being in prison, and then he's there for a certain amount of time, and then it says he goes before Pharaoh when he's 30. So he's probably in that 25 to 27 age range at this time. So think about that as you think about what he's facing and how he's conducting himself. He's pursued by a woman daily. He resisted temptation daily. He wasn't thinking about, if I get the master's wife on my side, what kind of privileges can I get out of that? How can I use that to my advantage? Because she could maybe pull some strings for me or look out for me or protect me or whatever. He wasn't thinking in that way, but he fled and got out because he realized this is a bad situation. I cannot be here. I have to leave. Great example to all of us. You get caught in a situation like this. Some people, they may have to quit their job. This other person, they're not taking no for an answer. I got to get out of here. I can't be around this person.
I never thought of it before, but whenever the brothers took his coat, they took his coat off of him and they used it for deception. Here he leaves the coat, he just flees out of it, and it's now going to be used for deception.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah, well, it is interesting. It echoes through there. Yeah. And it's false evidence yet again. Yeah. Good parallels in there. All right. Let's read 14 through 20, he flees outside. So let's go ahead and pick up at 14 and go down through 20, please. Who will grab that for us? Clint.
She called to the men of her household and said to them, see, me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, This is the way your servant treated me, his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison.
Okay, so what does she do here? What's another way to describe what's going on? What is her attitude? Why?
Vindictive anger.
Okay, vindictive anger. She's been spurned. She's been refused. She wants to strike out and hurt him because he refused to indulge her in her sinful passions. One lesson here is don't underestimate people who are intent on sin and you not participating and cooperating in what they may do to go against you. She's turning the tables and she's saying, hey, the reality was he was in there, he refused, he left the garment. She's picturing it like, oh, he came in to try to do something and he left his garment when I screamed. Orlando and then Ashley.
She's probably used to getting whatever she wants, and I guess she can't get what she wants. She's just retaliating.
Exactly right. She's probably used to getting what she wants.
She's also probably trying to cover herself and get her story straight because he's gone. She has to explain it to her husband.
Yeah, she has to explain to her husband and maybe other servants what has gone on. She grabs that coat or the garment there and puts a different spin on it. As we said a while ago, she's using it for deceit. Trent. Yeah, she wants to come out and get the story out there and frame it the way that she wants it. And of course, he's thrown into prison. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But what can Joseph do about this? When she's laying it out to Potiphar, what's his recourse?
Well, he could provide a rebuttal to Potiphar, but the result of that would be he would become a wedge of division between Potiphar and his wife. And as we talked about, I think Joseph understands that relationship. And in a sense, Joseph is, if you will, sacrificing himself to maintain the integrity of that marriage.
There's very little he could do. He could say, hey, I didn't do this. What proof does he have? Other than his word, what does he have? I mean, she's sitting there holding a garment and telling her story, making herself out to be a victim here. He doesn't have a lot to stand on.
Well, and refer back to his character, his practice, and all that he has, because
That's all.
This is a great inconsistency.
That's all that he can do. And sometimes we find ourselves in that position. We're being falsely accused, and there's nothing we can do. How do you prove you didn't do something? That's very hard when it's just a he said, she said kind of situation. I can't prove it. Well, that also speaks to the fact that, one, men and women who aren't married, like in this situation, should not be alone. You don't know what story is going to come out of something like that. You're totally innocent, but if they accuse you, what do you have? You have very little to say. Carrie.
One thing I think is interesting, it's just an observation, given how young Joseph is wisdom that most people don't develop until they're older in life, just having the foresight to, see the consequences of something rather than just living in the moment.
Right, exactly. Elijah.
I think part of that's because of his family. He's seeing how his brothers are. He's seeing the issues between his parents and well, his dad and his two wives, and he's like, yeah, no, I know where these issues lead. We're not going to go down this road.
Right, right. No doubt he has gained some wisdom observing the lives of the family there, and maybe hearing stories of different things of Abraham and Isaac and their behavior at various times. So he's very wise here, but he's being falsely accused. There's not very much at all he can do about it. When Potiphar is told about this, it says specifically that his anger is kindled. He becomes upset about it. Now, there are some people who say, well, Potiphar could have had him put to death, and instead he put him in prison, so Potiphar kind of knew about his wife and so on. Maybe, maybe not. The Egyptians, from what I've read, they did not have a death penalty related to adultery like the law of Moses did. And we can't read that back into this account, that there's not a lot in their legal records about adultery and these types of things. And so that's not necessarily the case here. Historic records do talk about them having these prisons, and so it was pretty common to have people thrown into prison, but it wasn't necessarily common for adultery to be thrown into prison for that. So there's something else unfolding here with him throwing Joseph into prison, which we'll touch on in just a little bit. Were there any other thoughts before we push on? Paul?
God's still with Joseph.
All right. Let's read verses 21 to 23 here, please. 21 to 23. Who will read that? Hank?
But the Lord was with Joseph and showed mercy, and he gave him favor in his sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph and all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it possible.
Okay. Question number 3, how did Joseph's attitude change in prison? I asked you to explain that. Right. It didn't. Any other thoughts there? Nancy, what did you say a while ago?
Character. His character remained the same no matter what circumstance he was in.
Character's not situational, right? His true character. He continued to conduct himself in an upright way. Trent. Okay. Yeah, he's committed to the Lord, and he knows serving him is the right thing to do regardless of what is unfolding. He's already been sold into slavery. Now, this is a step down. Do we all agree with that? And he was a slave, yes, but he wasn't a slave that even at the beginning when he was brought in, that he was mercilessly beat day in and day out and, deprived of food and all of that. No, he was cared for, but then he rose up. By the way, in his position in Potiphar's house, he was in a better position with more power and more respect than a free man in Egypt who is just a day laborer or a field laborer or a guy who just did his regular day-to-day things. This would have been a very high position he had, and now he's thrown into prison. Nancy, I think. Ron.
Yes. Yeah. As you were describing Potiphar and his authority, wouldn't it be probable that Potiphar may even be cognizant of this state now that Joseph is in?
Okay, here's the thing. Being the captain of the guard, part of what he was in charge of was that prison system. Especially, it says that he was in the prison where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. So this is like the capital jail, if you will. Potiphar's in charge of this. Now there's a guy who runs it day by day, as it talks about this other person, the keeper of the prison, who's there running it day by day. Potiphar's not in the prison day by day, but that keeper of the prison's under his authority. So that's where he stuck Joseph. You're going to jail here. I'm putting you over here. So any other thoughts before a couple more things? Nancy?
Just this scenario, everything that's happened to Joseph so far in Egypt just brought to mind what Jesus taught about letting our light shine. Because in the end, people see our good works and they glorify God. And over through these accounts, it says that people recognized that God was blessing him.
Exactly right. So here he is in this prison. It says the Lord is with him. The Lord hasn't abandoned him, no matter where he is, no matter the circumstances. The Lord is with him, and he has mercy from the Lord in here. But then also it says he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Why would he have favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison? Let me ask you this. Ask it a different way. Did God work on the heart of the keeper of the prison, like miraculously zapping him to say, you need to like Joseph? What's going on?
Joseph was a model prisoner.
It explains it, right? Go ahead.
He's not obnoxious. He's not clinking his chains or whatever it would be that would make the keeper annoyed with him or dislike him. He's not doing anything but what he's supposed to.
Okay. From a human standpoint, could you look at Joseph and understand everything he's been through? Here he is sitting in prison now. Why he would have a chip on his shoulder and be bitter? Yeah, there's a lot of people that would just be bitter, angry, upset. Life is unfair. I keep getting mistreated. She lied about me, and sit there and obsess over how he's been wronged by his brothers and by Potiphar's wife. And it's just, how could God do this to me? When Joseph's in prison, what's he not having to deal with day by day by day? Yeah, that temptation. He's not having to deal with Potiphar's wife. He was better off in prison than he was as the caretaker of Potiphar's home. All the privileges and things like that, all the authority, all the respect, he's better as a prisoner. And we need to keep that in mind. There may be things we want in life, but we're better off not having all of that and being in that circumstance, because for our soul, it's better to be over here. Humble circumstances, not having, dealing with difficulties is way better. John, you have some.
Doing this for the glory of God. He's willing to suffer because he puts God and his service to God first. In the New Testament, Peter tells us that we're to obey our masters, even those who are unjust, because God looks at that as a gracious thing. He says that multiple times. God looks at that. When you endure hardship because of your service to somebody else, God looks at that graciously because you're glorifying God and you're a good example to those around about you.
Exactly. And we see by his maintaining that attitude that the keeper of the prison puts everything in Joseph's charge. He puts the other prisoners in his charge. And it says that the keeper did not look into anything. He had complete trust here in this circumstance. And so his faithful service, his patience, his good attitude, it brought a reward. And of course, when we fast forward, we're going to see the ultimate reward that it brought in having this character and disposition. So, Lord willing, we'll pick up chapter 40 next week. We'll go quickly. We won't dig deeply into the dreams because we'll jump to the explanation, but then we'll move on with our studies.